Welcome to What's My Podcast. I'm Jen, and I'm a library specialist for Arapahoe Library District. In the last couple years, I've gravitated toward podcast listening for knowledge and entertainment. Whenever I have a question about an author, subject, or event, I think, I bet there's a podcast for that. I also love that you can get a lot of information in a short amount of time. I spend a lot of time listening to different content, and I'd love to share some suggestions with you. Today's segment is LGBTQ plus awareness and gender diversity. Listener discretion is advised. My first podcast recommendation is Never Before. Trans activist and author Janet Mock explains that her goal is to combine her love of conversation and culture, famous folk, and feminism to push her favorite figures to share new stories and participate in new conversations. It seems clear that Janet is committed to centering on queer people, people of color, and other marginalized voices who have been waiting for the chance to share their stories. This podcast is for you if you want to hear about others' experiences. Next is Nancy. This show focuses on issues affecting the LGBTQ community and specifically addresses the struggles of being queer and Asian. Kathy Tu and Tobin Lowe are unapologetic in the way they share their personal experiences and in turn encourage their guests and listeners to share in a similar way. Join them for provocative stories and frank conversations about the LGBTQ experience today. This podcast is for you if you are interested in discussion about queer culture. In Making Gay History, host Eric Marcus brings the voices of LGBTQ history to life through intimate conversations with champions, heroes, and witnesses to history. Eric is the author of dozens of books, including 2 editions of Making Gay History, Why Suicide, and Breaking the Surface, the best-selling autobiography of Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. Eric is also the founder and chair of the Stonewall 50 Consortium. This podcast is for you if you like history and listening to those who have lived it. Gender Stories with Dr. Alex Iantinafi will reflect on how gender impacts different areas of our lives. They will reflect on their own experiences as a therapist, educator, and trans-masculine non-binary person, plus interview guests to explore these topics. If you have a relevant topic that you want to talk about, you may contact Alex at genderstoriespodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is for you if you are non-binary and or want to gain an understanding of gender diversity. My last podcast recommendation today is LGBTQ Stories. Kevin Gertis has been collecting stories from those who identify as LGBTQ+, and sharing them with the world. He believes when many voices come together and demand that history is told, something magical happens. People become inspired, lives are saved, and the marginalized no longer hide in the shadow of its oppressor. This podcast is for you if you like stories and want to hear from others living an LGBTQ+ experience. I also want to do a throwback recommendation from my American History segment, and again recognize Queer Serial for its awesome coverage of LGBTQ history leading up to the Stonewall riots. There are so many podcasts being produced, and it can take time to find what you like. I recommend checking out the You Might Also Like list at the bottom of each show page. You can also search in your podcast app with keywords such as the subject or an author's name. All these podcasts can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen.